God says stop waiting, because what you prayed for is ready, and the delay you feel is not denial but preparation, alignment, and timing working together in ways your eyes cannot yet see. God says you have been measuring your life by clocks and calendars, but heaven measures by readiness of heart, strength of character, and depth of trust. God says you asked for change, and change has already been set in motion, but it does not always arrive like lightning. Sometimes it grows like a seed beneath the soil where no applause exists, where patience is the only witness. God says you have been standing at the door, knocking again and again, wondering if anyone hears you. God says the door has already been unlocked. What you are waiting for is the courage to turn the handle. God says fear has whispered lies to you, telling you that you are not ready, not worthy, not strong enough. God says those whispers are not my voice. God says my voice has been shaping you quietly, teaching you endurance when you wanted escape, teaching you wisdom when you wanted speed, teaching you humility when you wanted recognition. God says remember the nights you cried in silence, the prayers you spoke when words felt heavy, the moments you chose faith even when doubt screamed louder. God says none of that was wasted. God says every tear watered the ground where your answer now stands ready. God says you think readiness means perfection. But I say readiness means willingness. God says you do not need to know every step, you only need to take the next one with trust. God says stop waiting for a sign so loud that it removes all uncertainty. God says faith was never meant to erase uncertainty, it was meant to carry you through it. God says if you wait until you feel fearless, you will wait forever, because courage is not the absence of fear but the decision to move forward despite it. God says I have already placed what you need within you, and what you prayed for outside of you is now aligned to meet it. God says you have been asking why it took so long, and I say because the blessing you prayed for required a version of you that did not yet exist. God says delay was not punishment, it was protection. God says if I had given it earlier, it would have broken you, or you would have broken it. God says now you have learned patience, discernment, and resilience, and these are the hands strong enough to hold what is ready. God says stop comparing your journey to others. God says their timing is not your timing, their calling is not your calling, their struggles are not your lessons. God says when you look sideways, you miss what is unfolding in front of you. God says I am not late in your life, I am precise. God says even the waiting season had purpose, even the silence carried instruction, even the closed doors were guiding you toward the right one. God says what you prayed for is ready, but it will not force itself into your life. God says blessings respect free will. God says you must rise, step forward, and agree with what heaven has already decided. God says stop asking if it is time, your restlessness is your answer. God says the discomfort you feel is not confusion, it is transition. God says you are being stretched because you are moving into more. God says do not underestimate the power of obedience in small steps. God says sometimes the miracle begins when you simply show up, speak honestly, apply again, forgive once more, try one more time. God says you keep waiting for a dramatic moment, but often the shift happens quietly. Like a decision made in the heart that no one else sees. God says heaven celebrates those moments more than you know. God says you prayed for peace, and peace is ready, but you must release what steals it. God says you prayed for abundance, and abundance is ready, but you must let go of scarcity thinking. God says you prayed for love, and love is ready, but you must stop building walls where trust is meant to grow. God says your prayers were not just requests, they were invitations for transformation. God says I see how tired you are. God says waiting can exhaust the soul when hope feels postponed again and again. God says rest does not mean quitting, it means trusting me enough to stop striving in your own strength. God says when you move now, you do not move alone. God says my grace goes ahead of you, smoothing what looks rough, opening paths you cannot yet imagine. God says stop replaying past mistakes as evidence that you are unqualified. God says I am not limited by your history. God says I specialize in redemption, in new beginnings, in turning lessons into wisdom. God says what you prayed for is not fragile, it was designed to meet you where you are now, not where you were then. God says you have been praying for clarity, and clarity is coming through action. God says motion reveals what meditation alone cannot. God says take the step, and the light will meet you there. God says faith is not passive waiting. It is active trust. God says the sea did not part until the people moved forward. God says stop asking me to bless what you are unwilling to begin. God says I have already spoken, already nudged, already confirmed through quiet conviction. God says you felt it in your spirit when the idea would not leave you, when the door kept appearing, when the same thought returned with peace instead of fear. God says that was not coincidence, that was guidance. God says what you prayed for is ready, but it will require consistency, not just excitement. God says initial enthusiasm opens the door, but discipline keeps you inside the blessing. God says do not despise routine, miracles often live there. God says daily faithfulness is how extraordinary outcomes are built. God says you are stronger than you believe because you survived what you thought would destroy you. God says you are wiser than you feel because pain taught you what comfort never could. God says you are closer than you think because heaven does not announce distance, it announces direction. God says and the direction now is forward. God says stop waiting for permission from people who do not know your calling. God says their doubts are not my commands. God says I placed this desire in your heart for a reason, and I do not tease my children with empty promises. God says if it aligns with love, growth, and purpose. It aligns with me. God says you prayed for a breakthrough, and breakthrough is ready, but it comes through the narrow place where faith is tested. God says do not turn back at the moment pressure increases. that is often the sign that the wall is about to crack. God says perseverance is the final ingredient. God says listen closely. This is not the season to retreat, to shrink, or to settle. God says this is the season to stand up internally before anything changes externally. God says when your identity aligns with my word, your circumstances will follow. God says stop waiting for life to change before you change, be the signal, not the echo. God says what you prayed for is ready. And when it arrives, it will make sense why it could not come sooner. God says you will look back and see how every delay protected you, how every closed door redirected you, how every waiting moment refined you. God says gratitude will replace frustration when you see the full picture. God says now is the time to trust my timing more than your anxiety. God says breathe, step forward, and release the need to control outcomes. God says obedience is your responsibility, results are mine. God says when you move in faith, heaven moves with you. God says stop waiting, because waiting has already done its work. God says the preparation season is ending, and the participation season is beginning. God says rise with confidence, not because you know everything, but because you trust me. God says what you prayed for is ready, and so are you. God says let me speak to the part of you that still hesitates, the part that wonders what happens if you step forward and things do not unfold the way you imagined. God says faith was never a guarantee of comfort, it was a guarantee of my presence. God says even if the path looks unfamiliar, I will not abandon you on it. God says you are safer walking with me into uncertainty than standing still without growth. God says you have learned how to survive, but now it is time to learn how to live. God says survival taught you endurance, but living will teach you joy. God says do not carry yesterday's armor into today's promise. God says some of what protected you in the past will limit you in the future. God says release the habits formed in fear so you can receive what is formed in faith. God says stop waiting for everyone to understand your decision. God says obedience often looks unreasonable to those who are not listening to my voice. God says Noah built before rain, Abraham walked without a map, Moses stepped forward with trembling hands. God says I have always moved through people who trusted me before results appeared. God says you are part of that same story. God says you have been asking for confirmation again and again because deep down you are afraid of disappointment. God says disappointment comes when expectations are built without surrender. God says place your hopes in me, not in a specific outcome, and you will never be disappointed. God says what I give may look different from what you imagined, but it will always be better for your soul. God says the reason your heart feels restless is because it recognizes movement before your mind does. God says your spirit knows when a season is shifting. God says do not silence that inner stirring with excuses. God says restlessness is often the sound of growth trying to break through comfort. God says what you prayed for is ready, but it will require you to let go of control. God says you have been trying to manage every detail because you are afraid of losing stability. God says true stability is not found in control, it is found in trust. God says when you loosen your grip, you make room for me to work fully. God says you are not behind in life. God says you are not late. God says you are not forgotten. God says the timeline you compare yourself to was never written for you. God says I write individual stories, not copies. God says your story unfolds at the pace required to shape you for your purpose. God says stop rehearsing worst-case scenarios. God says anxiety is the imagination working without faith. God says use that same imagination to envision what can happen when I go before you. God says remember how many times I carried you through situations you once feared. God says I have not changed, and neither has my faithfulness. God says what you prayed for is ready, but you must stay humble when it arrives. God says pride can ruin what patience built. God says stay teachable, stay grateful, stay connected to me. God says blessings grow best in a heart that remembers where it came from. God says there will be moments when progress feels slow again. God says do not panic. God says growth is not linear. God says some days you will feel strong, other days unsure, but both are part of the journey. God says consistency matters more than intensity. God says keep moving, even if the steps feel small. God says you will be tempted to look back once things begin to change. God says familiarity can feel safer than freedom. God says do not romanticize seasons I already helped you out of. God says forward is where your future lives, not behind you. God says what you prayed for will also reveal who is meant to walk with you and who is meant to let go. God says do not cling to relationships that resist your growth. God says alignment will naturally bring separation. God says trust me with the pruning, it makes room for healthier fruit. God says you are stepping into a season where responsibility increases along with blessing. God says do not fear that weight. God says I only give what you are strong enough to steward. God says maturity is learning how to carry joy and responsibility at the same time. God says stop waiting for the perfect version of yourself to appear. God says you will grow into the calling by walking in it. God says readiness is revealed through obedience, not hesitation. God says start where you are, with what you have, and trust me to expand it. God says when doubts arise, return to what I already told you. God says my truth does not change because your emotions fluctuate. God says anchor yourself in my promises, not in temporary feelings. God says storms do not erase direction, they test commitment. God says what you prayed for is ready, and it will stretch you in ways that feel uncomfortable at first. God says stretching is not harm, it is preparation. God says muscles grow through resistance, and so does faith. God says do not resist the stretch, embrace it. God says you are not walking into this season empty-handed. God says you carry wisdom from pain, clarity from prayer, and strength from endurance. God says everything you need has already been deposited within you. God says now is the time to activate it. God says stop waiting for a future version of life to begin. God says life is happening now. God says every step taken in faith turns preparation into purpose. God says move forward with confidence. Because what you prayed for is not only ready, my presence goes with you. God says this is the moment where faith becomes visible. God says up until now, much of your journey has been internal, hidden in thoughts, prayers, and quiet endurance. God says now what I have been doing inside you is ready to express itself through action. God says do not shrink back when opportunity meets you. God says what feels like exposure is actually elevation. God says you will feel moments of uncertainty even as you move forward. God says do not interpret uncertainty as a sign to stop. God says clarity often follows obedience, not the other way around. God says trust grows strongest when you choose me again and again in motion. God says remember this, I do not rush, and I do not forget. God says every promise I make carries its own fulfillment. God says I am not limited by obstacles, delays, or human opinions. God says what seems impossible to you is ordinary to me. God says you may not recognize how much you have changed because growth often feels normal when you live inside it. God says look back and see how far you have come, how your reactions have softened, how your faith has deepened, how your strength has matured. God says that growth is evidence that the waiting season worked. God says do not be surprised when doors begin to open that once felt permanently closed. God says do not question whether you deserve it. God says I open doors by grace, not by merit. God says walk through with gratitude, not guilt. God says what you prayed for will not remove all challenges from your life. God says it will give you purpose within them. God says blessing does not mean ease, it means meaning. God says you will face moments where you must choose trust over control again, and I will meet you there each time. God says there will be days when you wonder if you heard me correctly. God says return to the peace that first confirmed it. God says I speak through peace, not pressure. God says anxiety rushes, but my guidance settles. God says stop waiting for the world to validate what I already approved. God says approval from people is temporary, but my calling is eternal. God says stand firmly in what I have spoken, even when applause is absent. God says you are entering a season where your testimony will encourage others who are still waiting. God says your patience will become proof. God says your obedience will become light. God says do not hide what I have done in you, let it point others toward hope. God says stay connected to me as things begin to move faster. God says success can distract as easily as struggle. God says make space for prayer even when life feels full. God says intimacy with me is the source of everything you prayed for. God says what you prayed for is ready, but it is not the destination. God says it is a doorway. God says beyond it lies continued growth, deeper trust, and greater purpose. God says do not stop seeking me once you receive the gift. God says you will not walk this next season perfectly. God says perfection was never the requirement. God says humility, repentance, and trust will keep you aligned. God says when you stumble, I will steady you. God says let go of the need to explain everything. God says some things will only make sense in hindsight. God says mystery is not absence, it is invitation. God says walk with me, and understanding will come in time. God says this is your confirmation, stop waiting. God says the stirring you feel is real. God says the preparation is complete enough to begin. God says begin with faith, and I will meet you with provision. God says rise, not in your own confidence, but in mine. God says step forward, not because you see the whole path, but because you trust the one who leads it. God says what you prayed for is ready, and my hand is upon you. God says go now. God says move with peace. God says walk in trust. God says I am with you, always.